Lewis Goodall was one of the BBC's most engaging up-and-coming journalists. But last year, he left the organisation to join Global, where he co-hosts the News Agents podcast, and that's with two other ex-BBC hosts. In a conversation about impartiality, he told this story. It's pretty revealing.
When I was at the BBC, Robbie Gibb, made my life really difficult day after
Robbie
day.
Gibb is the former director of communications for Theresa May, who then went to be on the board of the BBC.
Former communications.
And also helped found a rival broadcaster, GB News.
Yeah, exactly. And, not really talked about this before, he made my life really, really hard at the BBC. Day after day, I would hear from people saying, just watch it. Robbie's watching you. Now, because they had created this sort of confection that somehow I was sort of Labour supporting or, doing Labour stuff. By comparison to Robbie Gibb, my sort of grand summit within the Labour Party was, vice chair of Birmingham Northfield CLP and youth officer when I was 17 years old. And I'm sitting there going, hang on a minute, I'm being lectured about impartiality from a man who until checks notes like 12 months ago was literally head of comms in Downing Street.
I mean, very revealing story. So you've got someone who, it wasn't mentioned there, but who was head of political programming for the BBC, Robbie Gibb, who then goes on to be head of comms for Theresa May, and then goes on to be on the board of the BBC. And then you've got one journalist delivers pretty impactful scrutiny on a Conservative government, and then he's telling everyone that this guy's, in trouble. He needs to be careful. He needs to stop doing such interesting journalism.
For me, the problem with BBC impartiality has always been that I've never really understood what it meant. I could understand what it meant in a sort of technical basis, on the sense that, okay, you have, if you have a debate or if you have a topic being discussed, you need to have both sides represented. So you need to have, one person from each party or one person from each side of a debate. That in itself is kind of limiting, because particularly if you're talking about topics and, different positions on those topics rather than party positions, oftentimes there are more than two sides, right? So you're always kind of missing out one angle. So I could understand what impartiality means in a meaningful sense on that kind of technical level. But in terms of the kind of broader ideological apparatus of the BBC, and, where do people in key positions of power cleave towards, I've never understood how you can kind of achieve that. Because ultimately, you have editors, and editors make choices, and those choices reflect their networks and ideological framework to some extent. Some are better at disciplining that than others. And because the people who are in the BBC, particularly now, because, our media industry is so unrepresentative and so lacking in diversity, the people who occupy those key positions in the BBC broadly reflect our elites more so than regular people. The vast majority of them went to private school compared to, a very minority within the British population. So it doesn't surprise me that in reality, the ideological cleave of the BBC when it comes to who actually has overruling editorial power, that it cleaves towards the establishment. So what I tend to see, and we saw it in the Gary Lineker story, how he was treated very differently when he was saying Corbyn out versus when he's criticizing a Conservative Party policy, that impartiality tends to become a stick that is used to discipline anyone in the organization that is seen to have slight sympathies towards, left-wing views, or is used to it's used as a stick essentially to beat the left with. You have this idea of impartiality without a critical understanding of how the overrepresentation of elites within the BBC makes it really difficult to achieve that in reality. So I'm not surprised at all. What does surprise me is that the Conservatives are constantly going after the BBC and demonizing it. Not sure why, seeing as the BBC has historically been quite an important part of its getting hegemony. It's a really interesting anecdote there from Lewis Goodall that illustrates a broader point. And I do think that despite the kind of historical context that I've given there, that the revolving door, if we're going to think about it as a revolving door between the Conservative Party and the BBC, we can definitely say that in recent years, the hinges of that door have been very lubricated. So it has kind of gotten more explicitly worse, but it's always kind of been a bit of an issue in the BBC, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say the way you sort of square the circle of this idea that the BBC is both, helpful for the Tories and they attack it to make it more helpful for them. So I think the idea is, the Tories are constantly putting pressure on the politics team in the BBC or any team to say, if you are too critical of us, we will cut your funding, essentially. So I don't think their ultimate aim is to destroy the BBC. The aim is to keep the BBC on their toes so that they aren't critical of the government, which I think is probably what was going on there when it came to Robbie Gibb constantly spreading rumours that, potentially Lewis Goodall's time was up, and the intention there was to try and get the guy to do less critical work on the BBC. But eventually what ultimately happened is he decided, I can't really do the work I want to do at the BBC, so went and started working for Global, and now has a very successful podcast with 2 other BBC journalists that decided to leave the platform.